Are you truly stepping into the role of leader in your own life the way you know you're meant to? What shifts would unlock your full potential? It's time to explore those answers with the host of Sacred Leadership, intuitive business coach Sherisse Alexander.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sherisse Alexander, your host of Sacred Leadership with Sherisse on the Inspired Choices Network. On today's show, I am chatting with Alexandra Sing, COO of Capitalize Good. Alexandra and I will be diving into a discussion around DEI and consciousness and how the two can meet in the space of impact investing. What does consciousness actually mean? And in the context of DEI, what does that actually look like? And does it look the same in all corners of the world? As I continue to explore what sacred leadership looks like and how do we show up as sacred leaders, the topic of DEI seems relevant in the space of business and impact investing. So without further delay, Alexandra, first allow me to welcome you and say thank you so much for joining me today. I know I said a little bit about who you are, but I'll turn it over to you for a moment before we dive into the juicy topic of today to tell a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and all things amazing about Alexandra.
Thank you, Sherisse. I'm really excited that you're doing this, and I'm really honored to be on this podcast with you, having such an important conversation. As you mentioned, I'm the COO of Capitalize Good. Our whole mission is to scale equity-like capital for the social sector. I came to this work via impact investing. So I used to be an impact lender, and I worked across different geographies, primarily sub-Saharan Africa and the United States. Before that, I spent the first part of my career in investment management, so I was not doing anything impact related. It was very much commercial finance first, profit-driven investing. But I had a formative experience when I was in college when I studied abroad in Rwanda, and that was kind of my entry point to social enterprises. So I always knew that I wanted to do impact investing. I just kind of had a circuitous route to getting there. But that's the short background on me. I live in Washington, D.C.
Yay.
I love to travel.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's actually exactly how we met. Was working on financing for a project together. And, before we dive into the meat and the potatoes of, what the topic is here today, which is around DEI and consciousness, I kind of want to talk a little bit about capital itself and maybe pose the question to you. Do you find that we are seeing some evolution with capital in terms of, and what I'm talking about is traditional capital. Investor comes in, they want to see a specific type of return versus what we're going to talk about today, which is conscious capital. And you and I had this conversation a few weeks ago around conscious capital. Do you see some evolution in that regard?
I think there has been an evolution. I think it's been slow, and I don't think that we've always used the same terms to talk about the movement of capital. Impact investing, I think the term was adopted somewhere around 2008. So if you think about the greater history of finance, it's really still kind of a new
Mm-hmm.
field, although it has come a long way. But there were development finance institutions that existed far before 2008. And within the United States, there were community development finance institutions. And I think of them as the original impact investors. And the whole purpose was to move capital to places where it didn't currently flow, but was needed. Today, I think we see the same efforts, whether it's domestically or across international borders. The pace of capital movement isn't what it needs to be, and the way that capital is structured and deployed isn't what it needs to look like, right? Capital
Mm-hmm.
isn't just the exchange of funds, it is the interaction between different groups of people. And
Mm-hmm.
often those interactions are not equity centric. Um, and it has enormous implications for impact outcomes that we all really care about.
Absolutely. And you're leading right into the next question, for the listeners, because, we're using terminology that might be a little new. We know about traditional equity, traditional lending, et cetera. But what we're talking about now, we started talking about consciousness and capital. So I'll say to you, or I'll ask you, what does that look like to you? What does that mean to you when I say or use the terminology around conscious capital?
I think you have to have an awareness of what capital means to different people. For some
Mm-hmm.
people, capital is actually very triggering because they've had harmful experiences with the financial services industry. I see that day to day where I live. I think entire groups of people have been left out of the financial system. And when they've been able to access it, it hasn't been at terms that actually aligned with their needs. And oftentimes there was unintended harm that was created as a result. So I
Yep.
think conscious capital is being able to take into account historical context and understand that not everyone uses that term, understands that term in the same way. And oftentimes that can put up barriers to relationship building that is really fundamental to impact outcomes.
So it's really about having an awareness or pairing, because when we talk about what that term means, conscious, when I use the term conscious, what I'm getting at is having an awareness that it's more than just me, right? Like we're all part of this big ecosystem. And when we pair that, and I think you nailed it quite nicely, it's that awareness that what capital means to you and I does not have the same meaning or value in the markets that we are trying to operate in. And so it requires a real willingness, I think, and I'll actually ask you to weigh in on this. It requires a real willingness to like peel back through the layers, understanding the environment and not understanding the environment on a surface level, but really kind of getting into the details of that specific region and, maybe some of the trauma. Because let's face it, when we talk about money, there can be all kinds of wounds around money, and that takes a lot of work. So how do you do that?
It does. And when we talk about capital, it's not just financial capital, right? It's not just money. There's human capital, there's natural capital, there's civic capital. If we look back at the history, and we'll just name the context that we're probably both talking about, which is sub-Saharan Africa.
Mm-hmm.
If I really start to peel back the layers and think about the history, I'll just speak as someone who grew up in a Western country. We stole capital, right? We stole
Mm-hmm.
people, we stole resources, we stole land. And then when we had to give that up, we drew the boundaries and they were artificial and they created tensions across communities. We exited. And when we came back in, we said, okay, demonstrate to us that you're investment ready. And we're going to rate
Yeah.
you across different indicators, right? Ease of doing business,
Yep.
safety,
Yep. Safe,
ability to be
stable.
a good fiduciary of
Yeah.
capital,
A
right?
steward. Yeah.
Because those are the terms that we're used to. And so when we enter a new sphere, we expect everything to be teed up in a way that we can comprehend rather than
Mm-hmm.
having to do the work to understand the context that we helped create. Even if we
Mm-hmm.
don't feel personally responsible, there's a huge barrier to that understanding. And I do think that history matters. And that has to inform the work that we do.
100%. And, on this particular podcast, I talk a lot about the energy of things. So when you think about the history of this continent and what has occurred, and, if we take it in the, we'll say, non-physical topic for a moment here, and we talk about, and we see it in North America for sure with indigenous populations, and talking about the trauma that's been inflicted there and how much healing that needs to happen in terms of generationally, and we pair that in a business context. Do you think that or have you witnessed, aside from the work that you're doing, any other organizations, if you are open to speaking on it, where they are trying to like really take the approach of deploying capital in a way that understands that we got to do it differently, and not just talking about, and this is, you and I were having a conversation one day, and this is where this whole idea came from, around not just checking a box, but more around, okay, what we're doing isn't working. We have to find a different way to do it. Do you see anybody successfully doing that or trying to successfully do it?
I I don't know that I could name any that are, and that's not to say that they don't exist. I think there are a lot of impact investors who are very much impact first. and they are leading with intention, and they know they're not going to get it right the first time, and they're willing to introspect and conduct postmortems and think about how do we contribute to an unsuccessful outcome.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's the vast majority of people who are participating in investments on the continent. And that's also true domestically. I'll just
Yeah.
speak for the United States because I'm American. There is such a gap between capital owners and allocators and the local communities that impact investors want to interact with. I think there are organizations that are trying to bridge that gap, and sometimes it's not necessarily the investor, but it's pulling in a consultant who can help facilitate those interactions and serve as a translator for those two different groups. I don't necessarily see that happening on a wide scale. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not trying to justify or explain it, but I think that there are a lot of reasons that contribute to that. I think part of it is time and attention. To be able to do that work with integrity, you can't just have a one-off workshop on conscious capital or DEI or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't get solved in a day, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't come out of the womb fully formed, right? We do evolve, and often it is through moments, but those moments are not forced in a 3-hour unconscious bias session.
Yeah, absolutely. And that you and I have, like I said, had this conversation as it pertained to, specifically DEI. And then you and I did also have a follow-up conversation regarding exactly this same thing around conscious capital and how we begin to make the transition. So I wonder if, especially on this continent, the conversation we recently had was around maybe some of the pullback on equity investment and maybe around expectations not aligning with the reality of what those returns would look like. And maybe possibly that might be the shift to look at things a little differently, I would say, or even, putting these kinds of conversations out there more widely to say, like, our idea of what it looks like in a developed market is going to look very different to an undeveloped market. And we know that very cerebrally, very logically. But you can see that the two they don't jive. There's a whole, each region has its own history. So we must approach it in a very different way. So maybe this equity freeze, we'll say, will drive a little bit of that conversation to looking at things maybe a little differently. What do you think?
That's an interesting thought, actually, because what becomes difficult for a lot of investors is that when they're in deal mode and they are actively deploying capital, they are deep in underwriting, right? They're traveling, they're in the weeds on spreadsheets, they're drafting investment memorandums and presenting them to their committee. So they don't have a lot of free time.
Yeah.
When you're not deploying capital,
Mm-hmm.
you have a lot of downtime, actually. You have conversations here and there because you're still sourcing, but you're not actually doing the work of underwriting yet. You're waiting for your entry point. In that space, there is an opportunity to really step back and introspect.
Mm-hmm.
And you could do that internally. You could do that with some peer investors. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to facilitate that kind of conversation, but I think time is more abundant now than perhaps it was previously.
Yes, indeed. We are actually going to head to break right now, our first break. But when we come back, Alexandra Sing and I will continue on this conversation around conscious capital and DEI and all things around DEI and consciousness. We'll be right back.
Leadership isn't reserved for CEOs or world leaders. It's something each of us is called to embody in our own lives. But how do you awaken that inner leader with clarity and confidence? On Sacred Leadership with intuitive business coach Sherisse Alexander, you'll discover powerful tools and spiritual insights to align your words, actions, and outcomes. Tune in every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 Central, 9 Mountain, and 8 Pacific, right here on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com.
Are you a subject matter expert? Are you here to share your expertise with an audience waiting to hear from you in only the way you can deliver? Are you ready to have your voice amplified across the airwaves? Inspired Choices Network has a global radio platform streaming to millions of people across the world. Professionally produced and supported by an accomplished team every step of the way, you can broadcast from anywhere in the world, knowing your voice matters, and we ensure it is delivered with ease and efficiency. Eager to hear your message, the world awaits. Contact us today to become an Inspired Choices Network radio host. Email become a host at inspiredchoicesnetwork.com.
This is Sacred Leadership with Sherisse Alexander. To participate in the program, join the live studio audience in our chat room at inspiredchoicesnetwork.com. You can also send an email to Sherisse@pavitraleadership.com. Now back to the program.
Welcome back, everyone. You are here with myself, Sherisse Alexander, and Alexandra Sing from Capitalize Good on the Inspired Choices Network, where today we are talking about consciousness and DEI. And in the first segment, we were touching on conscious capital and if it is possible to successfully deploy conscious capital. And now we're going to continue on into this juicy topic and see what Alexandra and I can come up with in terms of solving the world's problems around money, to put it very simply. So, Alexandra, I think right before we went to the break, you were talking about there being this lull right now, which can open up the space for investors to maybe evaluate what they're doing and how to perhaps do it a little bit differently. So do you think then that in this time, I mean, I guess realistically speaking, where I'm going with this is like, what could that look like, right? Because as you said, it's baby steps. It's not going to be done in a weekend or a workshop. It's not going to happen in 1 year or even 2. It's a very layered process. What do you think that might look like after we've done the introspecting and someone wants to like, okay, give this conscious capital a go?
So I can speak to examples that I've seen in the United States. And again, it's not necessarily a widespread practice, but I am seeing more foundations that are engaging in impact investing, and they know that they don't have the expertise in-house, but they do have assets, and they have assets that they can liquidate and deploy quickly. So what they're looking for now are community partners who are more proximate to the issues and the people that these foundations want to interact with. And so they can move capital to those community partners, and those community partners then make decisions around what investments are made. And those investments can look very different. They could be loans, it could be equity, it could be grants, it could be a combination. But they understand the funding needs that different organizations have, and then they structure their investments accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
And so the foundation doesn't just completely exit, they remain a partner. They're a thought partner. They provide additional funding for capacity building and technical assistance if that isn't already available. And they ensure that there is a funding base.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not just we're pushing capital out and then we're not speaking again. It is still very much an active relationship, but the decision making and the power sits very much with communities.
Okay. So in that example, how do you bridge the gap then? Because I think often the disconnect is people in these environments knowing that they need funding for whatever project and not fully understanding. So, you know, when you're having these conversations and it's like, this is our hurdle rate, this is our mandate, ABC, XYZ, you know, spreadsheets and models and all of this stuff, which is so like, let's face it, if you're trying to do a project, like that's not your thing. Like that's not what you're thinking about. You're thinking about, I got this idea. I want to build it. How do you bridge the gap between that in that understanding of what's needed? And then I think the second part of that is most funds have like an exit time frame. So in my mind, it's going to take time because it's such a dynamic environment. You're going to have to account for when things don't go as planned. So how do we bridge that gap?
For bridging the gap, I think, first of all, it starts with understanding the role of different types of funding, right? So patient capital looks very different from short-term capital. But there's a need for both, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's called matching sources and uses of funds. There are some things that you can fund very quickly and you can see impact outcomes or get feedback as to whether it's working. And then there are other types of projects or initiatives that just take time, but you need to be committed over that period. There's a movement here in the United States that I think has gained some traction elsewhere called trust-based philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to say that the funder and the funding recipient don't have a relationship after the money moves, but the funder really does trust that the recipient knows what the funding needs are and they
Mm-hmm.
remain a partner. And they provide non-financial support as well.
Yep.
And they still evaluate the investment opportunity. So they still look at spreadsheets, they still look at financial statements, but they don't necessarily have an expectation that the budget that an organization has to submit is going to fit neatly within their template. They do
Yep.
that work on their own.
Yep.
And when it comes to impact measurement, they understand that impact outcomes happen on different timelines. And they co-create the impact metrics with the investee or the grantee.
Right. Makes sense. And so, with that in mind, being really more of a partnership, then that would also mean that the environment would require a certain unlearning that needs to happen in terms of like how we do things now versus where we want to go. And I suppose within that, let's call it like extraction investing, which I mean makes sense, right? We want a return versus like a, which is, I guess you could say, the default mode. So, I mean, I guess really what you're saying is like it's a bit of a process, and maybe perhaps this downtime will allow for shifting that model a little bit so that we move for more from what can I get out of this, which is very much what it feels like for it to, okay, how can I really partner in the environment? Because, you know, the one thing I say often about this environment is that it is ripe with a lot of opportunity, but it does need the right investment type of mindset or mind frame in order for it to be successful. So we can, if you look at it that way, and we maybe pivot a little bit more towards the DEI, and again, where this topic between you and I began was like, how do we, if we, you know, put them side by side, you and I think, had the conversation where it was like, it just felt like we were checking boxes versus really what that means. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I think I've witnessed a lot of philanthropic organizations and impact investors, particularly in the wake of the racial reckoning that was happening in the United States, hire DEI consultants.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that would be a half-day workshop. Sometimes it would be, okay, you're going to come in on a monthly basis over a 6-month period, and we'll go through different training modules. So there was a whole spectrum of engagement.
Yeah.
And I think the outcomes have been kind of mixed. I think there are a lot of quality DEI facilitators and consultants out there. I have 2 friends that run DEI organizations. They call it by a different name, but that's effectively what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they reflect a lot on some of the practices that happen in this space, and sometimes they're counterproductive. And so, where you should be creating entry points for people to learn, we're actually creating barriers. And so, sometimes it's the conversation is just not facilitated very well. No one feels
Mm-hmm.
safe sharing what they actually think. And so, you have a breakdown before the process has even really started.
Yeah.
In other cases, you just have people that weren't really motivated to begin with. They were doing it because they were forced to.
Yeah.
And at the end of the process, there's no accountability for what happens next. It's you
Yeah.
completed this training module, and that was the point in and of itself, rather than thinking about what does this actually lead to? What changes are we going to implement, and how will that change the opportunity set and the investments that we make, and ultimately what our portfolio looks like, and how our grantees or investees perform after we partner with them.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's been a lot of limitations with DEI consulting, but also it matters what the intention was for the person that hired that consultant or for the team that hired that consultant.
Yeah. And you know that brings about the, to me, the obvious question, which is like, well, how do you do it effectively? right? Because from my perception, and this has been tried, if you think about it, in various different ways. We might call it different things over the decades and the generations, where we are trying to force people to accept societal change, and we jam it down their throat, and that rarely goes well. And I mean, it's like with any change, if you think about it, how do we prep people for what that actually looks like? Because if I think about people just on an individual basis or even in an organization, there has to be a willingness and a benefit, generally speaking, of like, well, what's in this for me? Like, what do I get out of this DEI workshop that I have to take, aside from it's a compliance that I got to do to remain like whatever the reasons are? How do we shift the energy so that people can genuinely see the benefit of why it's important?
I actually think we overcomplicate it sometimes. We make it
Mm-hmm.
about something external, and really it has to start inside the house.
Mm-hmm.
People often think that DEI is going to fundamentally shift their investment strategies, or they're going to have to accept lower returns than what they were previously targeting. And actually, a lot of what happens when you go through a productive DEI engagement is that you really dive into, what do internal communications look like? What do our
Mm-hmm.
operating systems look like? Because if you don't fix the inside of the house, what happens outside of the house probably isn't going to go well either.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when you bring everyone inside the house to the table, and the conditions are set so that everyone can be the full version of themselves and share openly and candidly, you actually get really rich interactions and an opportunity for relationship building that you wouldn't
Yes,
otherwise have. And that
absolutely.
makes the investment process much more thorough
Mm-hmm.
and dynamic.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems is you have people that really care about equity, and they go into impact investing because they want to do good, and then they burn out very quickly.
Yeah.
Right? They have interactions that don't feel good, and they feel like they can't really make an impact because they don't have a lot of social capital inside the house. And it goes both ways too. You have
Yeah.
leaders that develop these impact funds and tested innovative financing models that didn't exist previously. And that is no small feat. And then all of a sudden you have these people that are coming in saying, well, you're not doing enough.
Yeah.
And that could be frustrating too, right?
For sure. Absolutely. And that is actually some of the feedback that I've gotten um, from some organizations when we talk about DEI, and like the challenges that are presented, the barriers to get that really rich, dynamic, honest, authentic, vulnerable conversation to really talk about like what are the experiences like. Because, and it maybe goes back to a lot of what we were talking about with, impact investing, conscious capital, and ultimately DEI, where it's like, if I don't feel safe within this space where I'm not going to be judged, or I'm not going to lose my job, or whatever the case may be, then there's no space to actually be honest and really begin to build a foundation where we can really impact and have some change come about. We are about to go to break, but I'm going to pose a question for you to think about during the break, which is around global DEI frameworks and what does that look like in the context of local cultural norms, and how do we bridge the gap on both of these? And you and I had a very lengthy conversation about this. So we'll
Sure
go to
did.
break, and when we get back, we will pick up this conversation. You are watching Sacred Leadership with Sherisse on the Inspired Choices Network. We'll be right back.
Leadership isn't reserved for CEOs or world leaders. It's something each of us is called to embody in our own lives. But how do you awaken that inner leader with clarity and confidence? On Sacred Leadership with intuitive business coach Sherisse Alexander, you'll discover powerful tools and spiritual insights to align your words, actions, and outcomes. Tune in every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 Central, 9 Mountain, and 8 Pacific, right here on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com.
How wonderful would it be to carry your favorite Inspired Choices Network host with you throughout your day? Well, now you can. Inspired Choices Network now has its very own mobile app. Our free app offers live streaming shows, along with thousands of podcasts and TV episodes. Our shows cover a wide variety of topics. Whether you're waking up with us, carrying us through the day, and taking us to bed with you, we're always here for you to enjoy. We're easy to find. Just search for Inspired Choices Network in the Apple App Store or Google Play Store.
This is Sacred Leadership with Sherisse Alexander. To participate in the program, join the live studio audience in our chat room at inspiredchoicesnetwork.com. You can also send an email to Sherisse@pavitraleadership.com. Now back to the program.
Welcome back. I'm Sherisse with Sacred Leadership with Sherisse on the Inspired Choices Network. And today I'm joined by Alexandra Sing from Capitalize Good, where we are speaking about consciousness and DEI. And right before the break, I did pose a question. Did you have enough time to think about it?
I did.
Okay. And the question was what her thoughts were around global DEI frameworks in the context, or again, not against, but considering local cultural norms, and your thoughts around how we integrate those two effectively.
Yes. So one of the big frameworks that has come out in recent years is this concept of a lens. And we often hear that in terms of a racial lens, a gender lens, an equity lens, or a climate lens. If you ask an investor what a lens is, I would guess that the majority actually don't know how to define that. In practice, what that often looks like is we added a few questions to our impact evaluation, or we now track, if it's a gender lens, the number of female entrepreneurs that we invest in. The lens itself is not a screen. It is the framework that you use to understand the context of an investment that you are making. The lens is what brings it all into focus.
Yep.
So if you're
So
thinking
like
about
glasses.
Yes, that's what glasses do.
They help you see better.
They do.
Yeah.
For example, and we have talked about this, if you're taking an equity lens, one of the pillars of that lens, or part of the framework, is thinking about employee ownership, right? The concept of ownership is a Western concept, right?
Yep.
The concept
Yep.
of private property or ownership is a Western concept. In theory, it sounds nice, right? Because it's a form of compensation. It's a way that you create alignment. It's a way that employees actually own the company that they work for and have buy-in. But if you look at local realities, that concept of ownership doesn't actually translate,
Yep.
right? If you're operating in a cash-based economy, the concept of equity does not resonate, right? Because you care more about money today than you care about the possibility of a higher return in the future.
Yeah, something abstract and down the road, and I don't know if I'm going to get it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And ownership brings risk too.
And responsibility.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of startups fail. And that means the equity or your piece of ownership might be worthless, despite the labor that you have put into building whatever the enterprise is. That doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to compensate employees that matter. That doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to create alignment that matter. But without that lens, you can't see it.
100%. And it's like you're like reading my mind with where I want to go. So I'm going to add in the lens of consciousness when inclusion becomes about energy rather than demographics. So when things feel right, or we use more intuition versus spreadsheet. And let me be very clear for the audience. I am not saying throw the numbers out the door. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying when we put on the lens or the glasses or the goggles of consciousness and look at it that way versus checking the box and I got to have this percentage of that, what does that look like then? What do you think that looks like?
When you're not just checking the box.
Yeah, when you're not just checking the box and you're saying, okay, we're going to put on a consciousness lens. Consciousness being about awareness and looking at more than meets the eye, like at face value,
Yeah.
and saying, okay, we're not going to worry so much. as important as it is, all the concepts under DEI, instead of just focusing solely on those demographics, I imagine what you're saying is, I mean, really, I guess they're lining up in the exact same way that we would talk about impact investing then, right? When we're talking about this consciousness lens that I'm tossing in here.
I would just love to see more partnership with local investors that actually understand the local
Mm-hmm.
context because it takes years. And even then, if you're not from the country that you're investing in, there are still things that you're going to miss. There are still
Mm-hmm.
interactions that are going to be superficial because trust and shared experience and history just isn't there, and you can't manufacture it.
Yep.
That doesn't mean that you can't still be supportive and be a partner in some way, but you have to find different entry points. And
Mm-hmm.
I'd really love to see more local investors receive investment instead of you have investors that are sitting in Europe or North America and they're making direct investments into companies or projects. Maybe they have a satellite team, but it's still not staffed
Yeah.
100% with local personnel.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see more of a movement to invest in fund managers that are on the continent.
Right.
And I think that is happening to some extent, but again, not necessarily quickly. And in the interim, I just don't think that there's any substitute for proximity, right?
I
You have to
agree.
be on the ground.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is in most businesses, if not all of them, it's about relationship management. And you can't do that 6 or 12 or 14 hours away. You can't do it by a Zoom call or a Teams meeting. Like you can't, it's not the same thing. You're so removed from the experience that it automatically throws up a barrier of you don't understand, there's not trust, and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering for you and your experience, does it look, I imagine it does look differently, but is there a region of the world where it's the impact investing and the DEI is like seeming to gel much easier and come together a little more seamlessly, or is it just kind of a hot mess all over the place?
I don't know that I see patterns. I see concentration of
Hmm.
people, and that for a long time has been in East Africa.
Yeah.
And part of that is language and customs, right? It's easier for investors that are coming from Europe or North America to interact in a space where they know the language and they understand the modes of operation. I don't necessarily think that that's going to be the case forever. I think that there's a lot of activity that's happening in Southern Africa and to a greater extent West Africa, but it will take a long time
Hmm.
before those regions catch up. I mean, in the United States, I do think that we're seeing more foundations hold board meetings in local communities and they're doing
Yeah.
more site visits. There is obviously a boundary between tourism and actual
Hmm.
genuine interactions and relationship building, but I do see people making more of an effort and realizing that now because of the macro environment that exists in my country. I
Yeah.
think people are seeing now there's an urgent need actually to bridge some of these divides. Are we going to do it well in the first pass? Probably not,
Hmm.
but at least there are some live case studies now that we can reflect on and
Yeah.
understand how do we take this blueprint and make it better.
And to me that, and I don't know that I've got a clear sense of this. Do you see anybody who's doing it somewhat successfully, understanding that we're not going to get it perfect, that there's going to be revision after revision after revision, but who do you identify that's kind of got, they're starting to get the hang of it, or at least starting to have success? And let's define success here for a moment, where it's what the investor is getting somewhat what they need. It might be a longer exit. There's a real partnership that's actually going on. Is there anyone that you can identify where it's been successful, if you can comment on that, that you've seen?
In terms of investors,
Yeah, that are kind of adopting a little bit of a different approach, even if it's not fully what impact investing should look like or conscious capital, but like is actually making some strides in this particular type of investment mindset.
Yeah, I've always admired the work that Kenny Arth does. I think they've always kind of been at the forefront of finding high impact projects and enterprises to invest in. And they do that with pretty favorable entrepreneur centric terms. I still have a lot of respect for Open Road Alliance, and I think, well, they're Open Road Impact now. But they try to bridge some of these capital gaps that occur when a transaction actually interferes with a company's viability, right? Because it just takes too long to get an investment round circled up. Domestically, I work with the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation in my home state of Arkansas. So if this is going to an international audience, people probably won't have any idea where that is, but it's where I grew up, and they are actually a very small foundation, right? Their grant making is probably not more than 5-6 million per year, but they bring bigger partners along with them, and they go into local communities, and what they can't do in terms of funding, they supplement by serving as the convener and the translator and the entry point to different resources that those communities need. So even if you're a small foundation or you're a small impact investor, there's still other ways that you can have enormous impact and catalyze other investors who otherwise would not participate just by being there.
Yeah. Now, looking, earlier here on the podcast, I was saying that for the time being, it feels like, and based on some of the conversations in the marketplace, that equity might be kind of slowing down or funding might be slowing down. What are your thoughts around that? Like if we take a short, mid, and long-term kind of view at the investment world and, around it in projects, impact investing, so on and so forth. What do you think it looks like? What do you think, what if you had a crystal ball, what would it look like 1, 3, and 5 years, or 1, 3, and 10 years from now?
I don't see how it lasts indefinitely. And part of this is actually, if you think about a traditional venture capital fund structure or private equity fund structure, this is where traditional models are actually helpful. Because if you're just sitting on cash, that's a drag on returns. You have to deploy it at some point. That is your mandate.
Yeah.
So I do think that there will be an impetus to do so. And in the meantime, people are just trying to figure out where the opportunities are.
Yeah, I think that's probably still going to take another, I don't know, 12 to 18 months maybe is what maybe more. I guess it depends on where you're talking about, because then there's so many other things at play depending on the market that you're looking at. I know politics always comes into play, and wanting to wait to see what happens with elections and that sort of thing. So I guess it'll be interesting to see how it evolves over the next little bit. Well, I guess you've kind of done this. I want to dig into a little bit more about Capitalize Good and some of the work that you guys have been doing. We are going to go to break right now. So when we return, Alexandra's going to share a little bit more about Capitalize Good, what they're doing, the blueprint that you spoke about. And we will be right back. But you are here on the Inspired Choices Network with Sherisse Alexander and Sacred Leadership with Sherisse. We'll be right back.
Leadership isn't reserved for CEOs or world leaders. It's something each of us is called to embody in our own lives. But how do you awaken that inner leader with clarity and confidence? On Sacred Leadership with intuitive business coach Sherisse Alexander, you'll discover powerful tools and spiritual insights to align your words, actions, and outcomes. Tune in every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 Central, 9 Mountain, and 8 Pacific, right here on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. This is Sacred Leadership with Sherisse Alexander. To participate in the program, join the live studio audience in our chat room at InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. You can also send an email to Sherisse@pavitraleadership.com. Now back to the program.
Welcome back. This is Sherisse, Sacred Leadership with Sherisse on the Inspired Choices Network. If you are enjoying this show, please give us a 5-star review on iTunes or the platform of your choice. I would be super grateful, and this will assist us in getting the information out to those that need it. If you are just joining us, I am here today with Alexandra Sing from Capitalize Good. And today, what we've been chatting about has been consciousness and DEI. Conscious investing, conscious capital, impact investing, all things around consciousness and money. And the question that I had posed, well, what I had brought or invited Alexandra to share more about was the work that she is doing over at Capitalize Good. So, Alexandra, tell us more about Capitalize Good.
Our whole philosophy is that any organization, regardless of tax status, is a business, right? The tax status might reflect a different type of mission. So if you're a nonprofit, your tax status reflects your social mission, but it doesn't mean that you don't have a business model that supports the organization.
Yeah.
Every business, regardless of the sector that it's in, requires two forms of funding: revenue and capital. But that is not widely understood in the philanthropic space. So we work with nonprofits, and most of them are domestic. There are some that have an international presence as well. But the whole idea is to scale equity-like capital for these tax-exempt businesses, because otherwise they are going to be financially unsustainable, and that will undermine the impact outcomes that funders and nonprofit leaders want to see. So to do that, we work with both nonprofits and funders. On the nonprofit side, we provide financial technical assistance, and on the funder side, we provide advisory services, basically on how to be better partners to grantees.
Mm-hmm.
And also, how do you interact with the impact investing side of your foundation? Because a lot of times there's no coordination. And there should be, because a lot of foundations have multiple different capabilities, but they're not necessarily deploying them for the highest and best uses.
Yeah. And so I imagine then, it sounds like then that it would probably be a lot of education and coaching on both sides of that, in terms of like how to bridge that gap, I guess, and getting the access to all the resources that you've mentioned here.
That's correct. So we do a lot of workshops.
Yeah.
And we have to be very intentional with how we explain financial concepts to people.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't
Yep.
necessarily lead with the term capital for reasons that we've already discussed, because for
Yep.
some people, that's just not an accessible term. And the connotations are not helpful.
Yep.
But I can use analogies to try to bring the importance of money and transactions to life in a way that can be understood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't require changing your view of the world. It's just kind of a shared understanding that money, for better or worse, is the way that we transact.
Yep.
And if you don't understand how it works, you will be left out, or you will be in an unfortunate and challenging position when having to negotiate with your funders. And if you're a funder and you don't understand how money works, well, you might not be deploying your money in the most productive ways possible.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so then at Capitalize Good, how do you guys bring mindfulness, I suppose, into a lot of what is very data driven and based on? So yes, we want to make impact and educate and make it all accessible. But how do you guys do that internally in house?
I learned very early that people are actually not moved by data.
Right.
Even though people will say that they are, funders will always say, well, show us the data, right? We
Yeah.
can be convinced, but we need to see numbers. And then you show them numbers that are inconsistent with their worldview, and they double down on their worldview. So I don't
Mhm.
think that people are moved by numbers necessarily. I do think some people care about them, but it's only one piece of what they care about. People are moved by storytelling, and
Yes, they are.
they are
Yeah.
influenced by relationships. So a lot of our work is steeped in case studies where people
Mhm.
can actually see themselves in different types of examples. So we try to bring that to life for people. And then we also try to be translators, and we do try to bridge the gap between a funder's understanding of what a grantee needs and a grantee's understanding of what they need. And we're
Yeah.
trying to help shift mindsets away from a mindset of scarcity to abundance. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Funding is limited, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be aspirational in what you're
Yeah.
doing. Because sometimes
You
it's not
know,
the amount of funding, it's the way that it's structured.
yeah, absolutely. And you said something that I imagine would be, interestingly enough, probably a more challenging barrier than people would understand, which is what you said around people are rarely moved by spreadsheets. Because let's face it, I can give you a model. You're going to test that model over and over and like just put the most outlandish sensitivities on that model just to see like how can I break it. And so often what I'm saying internally when we're talking about money is like people don't identify with solar panels and batteries and they just don't. They want to know like who are we impacting, right? It's like who are the people, like not only just in the business or the end user or so on and so forth. Is that, would I be wrong with that? That's actually a bigger barrier or bigger challenge than shifting that mindset. Like, no, really, people don't care about what the spreadsheet says. They're going to test it anyways, and they're not going to believe it. So, is that the case?
I think that is often the case.
Yeah.
But I also think that spreadsheets are often misinterpreted, right?
Yeah.
And at least in philanthropy, sometimes you're not even looking at a spreadsheet, you might be looking at financial statements.
Mm-hmm.
I have literally heard this story once from a nonprofit leader that I was working with. Her funder required her to submit financial statements, but then the program officer admitted she didn't know how to read them. But they were denied funding. And the basis was the financial picture wasn't what it needed to be for that funder to get comfortable. And yet, so there is a knowledge gap.
Yeah.
I think you have to package it in a way that resonates with the funder without compromising the story.
And that is equally a challenge, right? Because everybody wants to see the data, the story a little differently. And I guess this is ultimately where advisory services become really valuable because really, for lack of putting it a better way, you're kind of almost acting like a broker, right? I'm going to take your story. I'm going to polish it up with the supporting data that is going to appeal to this particular investor, right? Like that's ultimately what advisory is. We are just about done here, but before we call it a wrap, what is one juicy nugget that you might invite listeners to maybe bear in mind when wanting to become a little more conscious when it comes to impact and, capital?
Ooh, that's a really good question. When I reflect on my experiences, then I try to share this with people who are skeptical about DEI and who are uncomfortable having those discussions. I just remind people that sometimes we get more worked up about being accused of something that doesn't align with our self-view.
Mm-hmm.
And we're less concerned about the actual harm that a group is experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many ways that we interact with the world that make us uncomfortable. Having
Absolutely.
DEI discussions doesn't have to be one of them. But if that is the outcome, is that the worst thing that could happen? Right?
It
I
is
have a
what it
day
is.
where I experience some discomfort, or I'm accused of something that I don't think I'm guilty of. If that's the
Yes.
worst thing that ever happens to me, life is pretty good.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for joining me today on Sacred Leadership with Sherisse. And we will see you back here next week. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Sacred Leadership Show. Sherisse returns Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 Central, 9 Mountain, and 8 Pacific on the InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. Until then, continue taking small steps today to be a leader in your life for the collective.